A rich man thought his home was perfect, but one afternoon he walked into his garden and saw something that shook him to the core. His maid was on her knees, crying, eating from the dog's bowl. At first he thought she had gone mad, but the real reason? It was so heartbreaking it made the millionaire himself cry. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The Harrington estate looked like something pulled straight from a glossy magazine. Marble fountains trickled in the courtyard. Roses climbed over stone arches, and a driveway wide enough to fit 10 cars led to double oak doors taller than most men. At night, chandeliers glowed like fireflies behind floor-to-ceiling windows, a silent declaration that this was not just a house, but a palace built on the success of one man. To the city outside, Mr. Alexander Harrington was the perfect story. The boy who had grown up in a cramped apartment with nothing but second-hand shoes and a hunger for more had built a billion-dollar empire in software. He owned companies across continents, dined with presidents, and funded charities whose names appeared in newspapers. When people spoke of him, they used words like visionary and genius. But inside the mansion, beneath the polished floors and the gleaming cutlery, another truth lived, a truth invisible to the world, yet suffocating to those who served within its walls. Elena adjusted the collar of her plain gray uniform in the reflection of the pantry glass. She was 25, with gentle eyes that always looked a little too tired and hands that bore the faint scars of endless scrubbing. To most, she was just a maid in the Harrington household. To herself, she was a daughter fighting to keep her family alive. Every month, the envelope she received was carefully sealed and sent straight back to her hometown, a tiny village tucked between mountains. Her father lay bedridden, his lungs failing more each day, and the money she earned was his only chance of medicine. For Elena, the mansion wasn't just her workplace. It was her battlefield. Every mop stroke, every ironed shirt, every hour stolen from sleep meant another day her father could breathe. But there was one battle she was losing: hunger. The Harrington house ran on rules, most of them invisible but brutally enforced. The sharpest one was this: the staff are never to touch the family's food. Not a crust of bread, not a slice of fruit. Plates were washed with leftovers still on them, as though food belonged more to the trash than to the servants who worked themselves thin. Elena had learned the rule the hard way. The first week she arrived, she had reached for a piece of toast abandoned on a tray. Mrs. Harrington's voice, cold as frost, had cut through the air. "This house does not feed strangers. If you are hungry, bring your own meals. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Elena had whispered, shrinking under the glare. Since then, she had obeyed. The morning had begun before sunrise, as usual. Elena had polished the silver, dusted the library shelves, and carried laundry baskets up and down the mansion's endless staircases. The weight of fatigue pressed against her spine, but she ignored it, as she always did. By noon, her stomach ached with a hollow fire. She had eaten nothing since the day before: a cup of tea and a stale roll she had bought from her own wages. But her money had run thin, stretched too far between her rent, her father's medicine, and her younger brother's school fees. In the kitchen, the chefs prepared roasted lamb, garlic bread glistening with butter, and bowls of ripe fruit. The fragrance curled through the air like a cruel temptation. Elena inhaled and then turned away, gripping her apron tightly. To linger too long was dangerous. Back to the windows, Mrs. Harrington ordered sharply from across the room, her silk robe dragging like a queen's gown. The garden must look perfect by this evening. Elena bowed her head and obeyed. Always obeyed. She worked until her arms trembled, until her knees threatened to give way. When she passed the dining room later, she caught sight of the family's plates half-filled, untouched food waiting to be cleared. She bit her lip so hard it bled, then carried the plates away, dropping the contents into the bin. The sound of discarded bread hitting metal echoed in her ears like thunder. That night she would lie awake and remember the smell, but for now she carried on. By mid-afternoon, Elena stepped into the garden with a basket of laundry. The sun was bright, the roses swayed in the breeze, and for a fleeting moment she felt the ache of her stomach sharpen into something unbearable. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, whispering to herself, "Just a little longer. Just hold on." She spotted the family's dogs barking near their bowls. Their food had been poured generously, a mixture of meats, grains, and broth, more nourishing than anything she had tasted in weeks. She froze. Shame swept through her, hot and suffocating. What kind of human being looked at dog food and thought of relief? She turned away quickly, her throat tightening with tears. She was not an animal. She was not. But the hunger clawed louder than her pride. She sat on the edge of the garden bench, her eyes stinging as she thought of her father. What would he say if he knew? That his daughter starved while standing next to a feast meant for animals? Elena buried her face in her hands. Her tears dripped onto the apron she had worn thin. She tried to breathe deeply, but her chest felt heavy, her ribs sharp against her skin. Inside the mansion, Mr. Harrington closed his laptop. Meetings had drained him, figures and contracts cluttering his mind. For once he had come home early, seeking peace in the sanctuary of his garden. He loosened his tie, walked down the marble steps, and inhaled the crisp scent of roses. He was thinking of nothing until he saw movement by the kennel. At first, it was just a figure crouched low, shoulders shaking. Then his eyes adjusted and his heart stumbled. It was Elena, his maid, crying alone, knees bent in the grass. He frowned, confused. Something about the scene tugged at him, a whisper of unease. Why was she there? Why was she trembling as if the weight of the world sat on her back? And then, as he drew closer, his breath caught. She was holding a small bowl. The dog's bowl, and her lips were stained with broth. For a moment, the world tilted. His brain refused to believe what his eyes saw. His maid, the young woman who had always bowed politely, who scrubbed his floors with quiet dignity, was eating from the dish of an animal. Mr. Harrington stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw clenched, his fist tightening at his sides. What in God's name was happening in his own house? The moment Alexander Harrington saw Elena hunched in the garden, spoon trembling in her hand as she scooped food from the dog's bowl, the air seemed to leave his lungs. For a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, it was strange how utterly powerless he felt watching his maid chew in silence, tears running freely down her cheeks. At first, anger rose in him, anger not at her, but at the shocking absurdity of the image. It was grotesque, humiliating, unthinkable. A young woman reduced to eating what his pets had barely touched. Elena. His voice cracked, harsher than he intended. She jerked upright, the spoon clattering against the porcelain bowl. Her wide eyes met his for only a heartbeat before darting away, shame flooding her face like a storm. She scrambled to her knees, fumbling with her apron, words stumbling from her lips. "Sir, please forgive me, Her voice trailed into nothing, swallowed by the weight of fear. Harrington stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. He stared at her, really stared, and noticed things he had never allowed himself to see. The hollowness in her cheeks, the way her uniform hung loosely on her thin frame, the tremor in her hands that spoke not of nerves alone, but of exhaustion and hunger. His chest tightened. "Why?" His question cut the air, sharp but trembling underneath. "Why are you eating this?" His finger pointed at the bowl, but his voice faltered as though even uttering the words made them impossible. "You're not a stray dog, Elena. You're not—" "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the grass beneath her knees. Her voice cracked with a mixture of guilt and terror. "Please, don't send me away." The plea struck him harder than any accusation. Send her away? That was what she feared most in this moment. Not punishment, not ridicule, but losing the very job that had trapped her into such desperation. He crouched down suddenly, his towering frame folding until his eyes were level with hers. His expression was not anger anymore, but something far heavier, bewilderment laced with a creeping dread. "Tell me the truth," he said, his tone softer now, though it still carried the urgency of a command. "Why were you eating dog food? Elena, answer me." She pressed her lips together, her whole body shaking. Her silence was louder than a scream. The truth hovered at the edge of her tongue, but fear sealed it shut. She thought of Mrs. Harrington, of the threats whispered like knives against her ribs. "One word of complaint and you'll be out on the street." She thought of her father's medicine, her brother's school fees, the fragile thread of life tied to her paychecks. "Please," she whispered again, her tears dripping onto the soil. "Please don't make me say it." The billionaire's chest rose and fell sharply. He wanted to shake her, to force the answer from her, but something stopped him. There was terror in her eyes. Not the kind that comes from being caught doing wrong, but the kind that comes from a soul cornered with no escape. He swallowed hard, a bitter taste filling his mouth. Before he could speak again, the sliding glass door behind him creaked open. The sound sent Elena's entire body rigid, her eyes snapping wide with fear. Harrington turned slowly, his jaw tightening when he saw his wife standing there, her silk robe flowing like water, a porcelain cup of coffee in her hand. "What on earth is going on here?" she asked, her tone flat, as though she had discovered a misplaced vase rather than a broken human being. Alexander stood, squaring his shoulders. "Explain to me," he demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained rage, "why I just found Elena on her knees in the garden eating from the dog's dish." His wife didn't even blink. She sipped her coffee, her lips curling with faint irritation, not shame. "Because," she replied coldly, "she is a servant. And servants know the rules. They do not eat what belongs to us." The words hit him like stones. For a long, unbearable moment he could only stare at her. His face drained of color, his breath shallow. He turned back to Elena, who had bowed her head so low it seemed she wanted to disappear into the earth itself. "Elena," he said softly, fighting to steady his voice. "Is this true? Have you been forbidden to eat?" She shook her head quickly, trembling harder, but the truth was written all over her face. Mrs. Harrington's laugh, sharp and humorless, sliced the silence. "Oh, don't play the hero, Alexander. They're paid. If she's too foolish to bring her own bread, that is hardly my problem. This house has standards. I won't have the staff rummaging through our kitchen like rats." "Standards?" Alexander's voice cracked, disbelief wrapping around every syllable. His hands clenched into fists at his side. "You call this cruelty standards?" She was starving to the point of... He couldn't finish. The words choked him. His eyes flicked once more to Elena, who was quietly weeping, her thin body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked her, his voice breaking now, stripped of all authority, leaving only a raw plea. "Why, Elena? Why suffer in silence?" Her answer came in fragments, each word pulled painfully from her chest. "Because," she said, "if I complained, I would be thrown out. And I can't lose this job. My father is sick. All my wages go to him. If I lose this, Her voice collapsed into sobs. "He won't survive." The words shattered him. The proud billionaire staggered back a step, his throat closing as though invisible hands were gripping it. His vision blurred, and for the first time in years, tears stung his eyes. He had built an empire, had more wealth than entire towns, and yet under his own roof, a young woman had been reduced to starving, to swallowing her shame along with the food meant for dogs. Also, her father might live one more day. He turned slowly toward his wife, his voice raw, trembling, almost unrecognizable. "Do you hear her? Do you understand what you've done?" Mrs. Harrington rolled her eyes and waved her hand dismissively. "Don't turn this into melodrama. She's just a maid. They come and go." But Alexander Harrington's gaze burned with something fierce and uncontainable, something that made even his wife falter for the first time. He pointed a trembling hand toward Elena, still kneeling in the grass. "She matters. More than you realize. More than you perhaps ever will." His wife's lips parted, but no words came. The garden fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Only Elena's quiet sobs remained, weaving through the roses like a fragile hymn of truth. And in that silence, the mighty man who thought he ruled everything felt his own heart crack wide open. The silence in the garden stretched so heavy it pressed on Alexander's chest. He stood staring at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. The porcelain cup in her hand gleamed under the sunlight, steam curling lazily upward, while just a few feet away, Elena knelt in the dirt with her face wet from tears. The contrast struck him so hard it felt unreal, his wife sipping luxury while his maid trembled with hunger at the foot of their garden. Mrs. Harrington exhaled sharply, as if bored by the entire scene. "Alexander, you're being dramatic." She knew the rules from the day she was hired. "If she chooses to starve rather than buy her own food, that is not my concern. We are not running a charity." Those words, spoken so coldly, drove into him like knives. "Not your concern?" His voice cracked. "This is happening under my roof, under my name, and you dare to call it not your concern?" He turned toward Elena again, his tone shifting, softer but desperate. "Tell me, Elena, how long has this been going on? How long have you been starving in this house?" Her lips trembled. At first, no words came, only small, uneven breaths. Then, as though the dam inside her finally broke, the truth poured out in fragments. I send everything home. Every month. My father, he's sick. He needs medicine we cannot afford. My brother. He's still in school. If I don't send the money, he will have to leave. I thought I could manage with tea with bread when I could afford it, but her voice cracked again, her chest heaving. This week I had nothing left. Not a coin. I told myself I could bear it, but the hunger, it crushed me. And then today I saw the dog's food and I thought, just a spoon. Just enough to quiet the pain. I wasn't stealing, sir, I swear. I was only trying to survive. Her words, fragile and trembling, fell over the garden like ashes from a fire. Alexander's body swayed as though the ground beneath him had shifted. A lump rose in his throat so fierce he could barely breathe. He had imagined her eating scraps because she was careless or foolish. But this? A daughter carrying the weight of her father's dying breaths? A sister protecting her brother's future with her own hunger? He pressed his hand to his forehead, his vision swimming. For all his billions, for all his empire, he had been blind in his own home. He had written checks to hospitals overseas, sponsored scholarships for strangers, built shelters for people he'd never meet. Yet here, within the very walls he walked every day, a loyal servant had been reduced to choking down shame with every bite of food meant for his pets. He staggered a step closer to her, his voice breaking. Elena, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me? Her shoulders shook violently. Because she said if I complained I would be thrown out, she whispered, gesturing weakly toward Mrs. Harrington. And if I lost this job, my father would lose his medicine and my brother would lose his chance at school. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I bore it alone, at least they would survive. My suffering would mean nothing if they could live. Alexander's knees buckled, and for the first time in decades he sank down onto the grass beside a servant. His hand hovered in the air, trembling, ashamed even to touch her, as though his wealth-stained fingers had no right. God, he whispered, his throat raw, his eyes blurred with tears. Forgive me. Forgive me for not seeing. For letting this happen while I lived blind in my own home. Mrs. Harrington scoffed. You're making a spectacle of yourself. She is a maid, Alexander. Nothing more. That was the moment something snapped inside him. He turned, his eyes blazing in a way that made even his wife step back. Nothing more? His roar shattered the quiet of the garden, birds scattering from the trees. She is a human being. A daughter, a sister, a soul with dignity. And you who call yourself mistress of this house, dared to strip her of that? His wife's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. For once, her arrogance faltered under the storm in his voice. He turned back to Elena, who was still hunched, her face hidden by shame. Slowly, he placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. Look at me, he said softly, almost begging. She lifted her tear-streaked face, and the sight nearly destroyed him. Hollow cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, lips still stained faintly with the broth of the dog's bowl. You will never go hungry again, he vowed, his words trembling but resolute. Not while I breathe. Not while I have the power to stop it. Do you understand me? Her sobs deepened, but she nodded, her body trembling with the release of years of silent suffering. For the first time she felt seen, not as a servant, but as a person whose pain mattered. Alexander pulled in a ragged breath, tears rolling freely down his face. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, none of it had ever broken him. Yet this moment, this unbearable truth in his own garden, brought him to his knees like a child. He looked at his wife one last time, his voice low but filled with fire. I don't know the woman you've become, but I will not share my roof with cruelty. Not another day. The cup in her hand trembled. She tried to mask it, but Alexander saw. For the first time in years, she realized his heart no longer bowed to her pride. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the perfect garden, Alexander Harrington, billionaire, tycoon, visionary, felt the weight of true wealth. Not in stocks, not in marble, not in gold, but in the fragile dignity of a maid who had chosen hunger to keep her family alive. He wept openly, the sound raw and unguarded, while the roses swayed silently in the breeze. The garden lingered in silence after Alexander's vow, as though even the earth itself was listening. Elena knelt in the grass with her tears still falling, and Alexander remained beside her, his once proud figure bent low, his face wet with the weight of truth. The man who could bend markets with a signature now found himself powerless against the wound in his own heart. He rose slowly, not with the arrogance of a master, but with the humility of a man who had seen his own blindness laid bare. Extending his hand to Elena, he whispered, Come, you will not kneel here any longer. For a moment she hesitated. Years of submission had trained her body to stay low, to stay quiet, but the sincerity in his trembling hand gave her courage. She placed her small, frail fingers into his palm, and he pulled her gently to her feet. She swayed unsteadily, weak from hunger, but he steadied her with both hands, as though afraid she might break. "From this day forward," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the garden like a vow etched into stone, "no one in my home will suffer hunger. Not one servant, not one worker. If I can feed the world, I can feed those who give their lives to keep this house alive." His wife's voice sliced through the air, cold and sharp. "You can't possibly mean to change everything because of one maid's dramatics. Alexander, you'll ruin the order of this house." He turned, his eyes hard as flint. "If this house's order requires cruelty, then it deserves to be ruined. From this moment, your rules end here." Mrs. Harrington's lips parted, but whatever words she meant to say withered under the fire in his gaze. For the first time, she realized the fortress of pride she had built around herself was crumbling, and Alexander was no longer standing inside it with her. He looked back to Elena. "Where is your father being treated?" Her voice shook. "A small clinic, back home. They give him medicine when I can send enough. But sometimes, weeks go by without it." His chest tightened again, but this time with resolve, not despair. "No more," he said firmly. "He will have every treatment he needs. I'll send my own doctor, arrange everything. Your brother will not leave school. He'll finish with every chance I can give him." The words were too much. Elena's knees threatened to give way again, but this time it was not hunger that weakened her. It was the sheer weight of relief. Her sobs came softer now, almost disbelieving. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," he said gently, his own voice breaking again. "It is I who must thank you, for enduring, for giving everything, for reminding me of the humanity I had forgotten in all this wealth. You've shown me what true strength looks like, Elena, and it doesn't wear suits or sit in boardrooms. It kneels in gardens, starving, yet still fights to save the lives it loves." The words carved themselves into the moment like scripture. That evening, for the first time in the Harrington mansion's history, the dining table stretched long, not just for family, but for every member of staff. Elena sat at the edge, too timid at first to touch the food, until Alexander himself placed a plate in front of her, insisting, "You will eat before anyone else." The other servants, stunned and hesitant, watched their employer with wide eyes as he broke bread with them, not above them. He looked around the table and spoke softly but firmly. "This is your home too, and from now on, no one here will ever be made to feel less than human." The cooks wept openly. The gardeners bowed their heads in gratitude. Elena lifted her fork with shaking hands and ate. Not dog food, not scraps, but a warm meal given with dignity. Each bite was a quiet victory over the silence she had endured. Word spread quickly, not through headlines, but through whispers among the staff. The house that had once been ruled by fear now blossomed with something far more powerful than perfection: compassion. Alexander began to join the staff for meals once a week, not as a display but as a ritual, a reminder to himself of what he owed the people who sustained his home. He created a fund for his employees' families: medicine, schooling, emergencies. No longer were they faceless workers. They were people, and he would honor them as such. Elena's father received treatment within days. The frail man who had once clung to life with shallow breaths found strength again, his color returning, his eyes lighting up at the sound of his daughter's voice over the phone. Her brother remained in school, his future intact, no longer shadowed by the threat of poverty. And Elena? She walked through the mansion differently now, not with pride but with quiet dignity restored. She still worked, still polished and cleaned, but the weight of shame was gone. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was respected. As for Alexander, he found himself changed in ways deeper than he could explain. His wealth no longer dazzled him as it once did. The glow of chandeliers, the glitter of marble, all seemed hollow compared to the glow of gratitude in the eyes of those he had once overlooked. For years he had measured his worth in numbers and power. Now he measured it in something far greater: the ability to heal, to lift, to honor. One late evening, as he walked alone through the quiet garden where everything had unfolded, he stopped by the roses and closed his eyes. The memory of Elena weeping in the dirt, her lips stained with dog food, pierced him again. But this time it was not despair that filled him. It was purpose. That moment had broken him, yes, but it had also rebuilt him into something new. He whispered into the still air, almost like a prayer. A man's true wealth is not in what he keeps, but in what he gives. And may I never forget that again. The wind stirred softly, rustling the roses. Somewhere inside the house, laughter rang from the kitchen, the sound of servants no longer silenced, but living, breathing, eating together in peace. And there, in the quiet, the billionaire who had once thought himself powerful finally understood the greatest truth, that compassion, not riches, was the currency of a life well lived.
If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that heal the soul.